So moving on, now we're going to think a little bit about another way, another approach, I guess I should say, to understanding what makes an organizational structure work or what makes it good. And what Mintzberg put out the idea of in one of the most influential articles really ever written in this organizational sociology literature was the idea that in essence what an effective organization does, a good organizational structure, is it's going to match the organizational structure, the organizational control to the environment that it's facing. So each, in essence, think of this as like a contingency theory where different environments, and we'll explain what that means, is tell you that some types of organizational structure is going to work better than others. And one of the things we're going to see is that a lot of times, even when you're trying to change a work process, you're also changing work structure. So it's important to understand how these two things fit together and how some environments, just like our closet parable, but some environments are going to be better suited to some organizational structures than others. So this is the basic idea. So originally, with a lot of, in talking about organizational structure, people talked about a lot of things. Should they specialize a job? Should there be behavioral formalization? Should there be training, unit grouping, etc.? And what Mintzberg did was took a lot of very extensive, sort of messy literature with a lot of words in it and said, look, let's just try to simplify all this down to we're going to talk about 5 sort of ideal type organizational configurations, 5 coordination mechanisms, and 5 parts of the organization. And in essence, everything that we're concerned with an organization, which is in essence coordination and control, we're going to think about how the environment matches up with these 5 configurations, 5 coordination mechanisms, and 5 parts of the organization. So let's just start by recognizing the parts of the organization. This should look familiar. That's just the strategic apex, technostructure, support staff, middle line, and operating core. Again, what I've done here is put the definitions for you, even though you should refer back to the earlier lecture, I think part 1, for a longer discussion of these 5 types and examples of them. What are our 5 then mechanisms or sort of sets of features that we can use to coordinate and control? So with direct supervision, as we mentioned before, right, this is going to be some sort of charismatic authority resting on the supervisor. So in the case of the firefighters, they didn't know their the ranger who was leading them, and they didn't listen to him whenever he gave a command, and as a result, they all died, which is tragic, and it gives you a sense of why it is that direct supervision, without that personalized or sort of charismatic authority, the supervisor, the idea of just a stranger was telling them that it wasn't effective. They didn't listen to their supervisor. Just being called a supervisor wasn't enough. Standardizing work processes is another approach, and it can be quite effective because, in essence, the authority becomes to rest on the technology and standards of the work process itself. So you can imagine that if you're on the assembly line, the work process sort of, if you mess up, the whole machine grinds to a halt, in essence. And so you have to sort of keep up with the flow, and that's how you know that people are coordinating because they're in the right place on the assembly line, and they're also they are being controlled because they have to keep working or else something's going to get messed up. But what about whenever you don't have that option of that type of standardization? Well, one thing you could do, in essence, is standardize skills. So here's when you get into training. It can become quite important in some environments to have people who are quite skilled just go out and be able to exercise that professional authority without having sort of a direct supervision. So most professionals, we're going to see, fall under this skill standardization idea. Another way to do would be to standardize output. So maybe you can't work in an assembly line, but like many salesmen, you might be able to have monthly quotas. So in essence, what you're trying to do is measure, control, and monitor the outputs. So you aren't measuring and controlling the work itself, the workflow, but the output of that work. Finally, the one that is incredibly difficult is never really often used necessarily in many organizations. It's a part of everyday life, but rarely used as the only control mechanism. It's more of an informal one, is the idea of mutual adjustment. So think back to the managers I talked about before, where everyone's sort of an equal, or even if you think about, again, our dotted line problem, part of what you might need to have to do is, in essence, when you've got multiple people holding power, you need to communicate, maybe a little bit of bargaining, and there needs to be some degree of benefit of the doubt or goodwill on both sides, because if there's not that, it can very quickly grind to a halt. And so instead of mutual adjustment, you get rivalry and conflict. So how does that then relate now that we've got our types and our controls? So what we're going to then now introduce are the 5 types. So before I mentioned professionals, and so we can think about a professional bureaucracy as being something like doctors, lawyers, accountants, again, are often part of a professional bureaucracy. A machine bureaucracy is more of the organizational type that's used to refer to production, so very much what it's called. Divisionalized form, these are retail establishments by and large. So these are the organizations that often have this geographic divisionalization, not the functional breakdown. There's a simple structure, right? This is our firefighting unit. And then finally, adhocracy. This is the thing that doesn't really exist as a formal organization, but we have to have something to call the cases where you need mutual adjustment. Now, those are just the 5 types of organizations, and what's interesting here is how they match up to what environment they're supposed to be in. So in essence, when you have a dynamic, always changing environment, and it's a fairly simple one, so again, the wildfire they thought they were fighting initially, it would be perfectly reasonable to have a simple structure as a way that one approaches and manages that environment. Because if it's not stable enough, you've got to have, in essence, the more dynamic it is, the more you typically have to rest on individualized decision making and discretion. And so there's no way to sort of have these processes when you've got a more dynamic environment. So you can see then, only when you have a more stable environment can you afford to go up to trying to manage things. Now, when it's quite a simple one, then you can simply manage all the work process, sort of from beginning to end. As it gets more complex, and in particular when you have a lot of where what they're going to sell, say in one city, or the demands you might have among one group of constituents is different than another group's, you might need a lot more discretion pushed down some. So that's when you end up with a more divisionalized form where you're controlling outputs instead of work processes, because it's hard to have the same degree of control. Finally, when it's a complex, fairly stable environment, right? It has to be somewhat stable because otherwise training won't help. If it's constantly changing, it takes an immense amount of training. So you can imagine that science sort of fits into the complex and dynamic a little bit more closely than all other professional bureaucracies, because you're dealing with the unknown. I should say, yes, you could also put, in place of dynamic, you could also just put unknown as another way to think about the dynamic environment. So in essence, professional bureaucracies, again, the power has to be pushed down and out in an organization to the people actually doing the service delivery, like the doctors or the Wall Street brokers or whomever, because the environment is complex enough that there's no sort of one-size-fits-all solution to many situations. Now, it's difficult because this is part of where you can get organizational stress. So you can have something like an NHS or National Health Service in the UK that actually is run a little bit more like, at least in some cases, something that looks more like, say, the divisionalized form or machine bureaucracy in some elements of it. Not completely, but this is part of what, like even the health system here in America, when you have a lot of insurance companies, a few big ones, sort of controlling a lot of the medical service provision through rules about what can be reimbursed, it takes discretion out of the hands of the bureaucracy, putting it into more of actually managing processes. And that's definitely true in more centralized healthcare systems. So I've been referring to this obliquely, but just to be very clear here, power and control in the organization varies in essence depending on what type or form of an organization it is. So when you have, in essence, a simple structure, which is the A over far upper left-hand side, all the power's at the top, right? It's all in the hands of the one or two people at the top that are running things. The machine bureaucracy pushes out power some into the technostructure because they're the ones who are controlling the work process. And that's why I mentioned before that engineers are a great example of this, because they tell everyone on the assembly line, in essence, how to work. The divisionalized form, what you've done is there's still some control at the top, a little bit in the technostructure, but you've pushed much more down to middle management. So the sort of head of a realty office or the manager of the Gap, right? You've pushed it down in divisionalized form. An adhocracy, it's all over the place. This is why they don't really exist. We're just going to ignore that. But finally, the professional bureaucracy, what you can see there is that professional associations that in essence serve at the strategic apex center don't almost even exist, and they certainly don't have a lot of control over their members. They have limited control, like they get to sanction who belongs and who doesn't, say in the case of a bar exam, and maybe in the case of residencies, there's some central control over who gets them and who doesn't. But again, it's very much that most of the power is down in the operating core, the professionals themselves. So probably it's become somewhat obvious here, but in essence, what you can imagine is that each of these different organizational forms, in essence, corresponds to different coordination mechanisms that corresponds to the structure itself. And since it should be fairly clear by now, I'm not going to repeat a lot of this, but this just sort of helps you see how things match up for your notes. So just to summarize all the things that we've talked about, these are the 5 ideal type organizations where you have a configuration, simple structure through, say, visualized form or adhocracy, what the basic part is that's emphasized, with the coordination, basic part being basically where most of the power is, the coordination mechanisms that are often used, and finally the environment that they tend to work in. So you get visualized form in a market-based market, as we talked about before, and machine bureaucracy, and more of a centralized or hierarchical established organization, and often concerned with production.